Imagine a prison, right?
Right.
But the doors are left wide open.
Yeah, the gates are completely unlocked.
Exactly. Unlocked. And there are absolutely no armed guards anywhere on the perimeter, yet not a single prisoner ever, tries to escape.
They don't riot. They don't rebel.
No.
Yeah.
They don't even scare longingly at the outside world. And it's not because they're terrified of what happens if they leave. It's because they have been fundamentally biologically and psychologically engineered to just love their cells.
Right. They genuinely believe the prison is a paradise.
Which brings up a crazy question. Ask yourself, how do you overthrow a dictator when the oppressed population is fiercely, passionately in love with their own subjugation?
Well, and it completely paralyzes our traditional understanding of tyranny, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're so conditioned by history to look for the overt signs of oppression. Secret police, censorship boards, military crackdowns.
The boots on the ground.
Exactly. And because of that, we become entirely blind to a system that uses pleasure as its primary weapon.
And that is exactly why we are so glad you, the listener, are here with us today. Because we know you are insanely curious. And you don't just want the surface-level summary. You want to get straight to the absolute core of the most complex, unsettling ideas out there.
The ideas that really make you question everything.
Right. So our mission today is to take a deep dive into what is arguably the most terrifyingly accurate blueprint of human control ever conceived. I'm talking about Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
But just to be clear, we aren't just going to recap a sci-fi story about test tube babies.
No. We are going to dismantle the actual architecture of this world to show you how engineered consent, relentless comfort, and, mandatory pleasure are infinitely more effective tools for a totalitarian regime than violence or fear could ever be.
It really is a masterclass in this concept of softness as control.
Okay, we'll unpack this because I think to really get it, we need to look at the author's own perspective.
Yeah, to truly grasp the mechanic of this world, we can't just jump straight into the narrative. We have to start with a foundational framework. And Huxley himself provided that in a retrospective foreword he wrote in 1946. So this is 15 years after the novel was first published.
Which is a huge time gap, historically speaking.
Massive. That specific historical vantage point, writing in the immediate smoldering aftermath of World War II is totally essential for understanding his ultimate thesis.
So let's contextualize 1946 for a second. The world has just witnessed industrial-scale genocide. They've seen the obliteration of cities across Europe and Asia, and most crucially, the detonation of the atomic bomb.
Right. Humanity had literally just invented the machinery of its own extinction.
Exactly. And Huxley acknowledges this right out of the gate. He admits that in his original manuscript for Brave New World, he completely missed the concept of nuclear fission.
Yeah, there are no atom bombs in his utopian future.
Right. But he makes this bold, almost counterintuitive claim. He says that omission really doesn't matter to the core message of his book.
Well, he argues that the omission is irrelevant because the central theme of Brave New World is not the advancement of science in a broad, physical sense. It's the advancement of science specifically as it directly affects human individuals.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he tacitly takes the massive triumphs of physics, chemistry, and engineering for granted. Those are just the tools. His focus is entirely on the sciences of biology, physiology, and psychology.
This is about the internal stuff.
Right, and he draws a fascinating, albeit dark, distinction here. He calls atomic warfare the penultimate revolution.
Okay.
It's just the next highly explosive phase of human destruction.
Mm-hmm.
But the ultimate revolution, what he terms the really revolutionary revolution, takes place on an entirely different battlefield.
Yeah, he writes that this ultimate revolution is to be achieved not in the external world, but in the souls and flesh of human beings. That represents a massive pivot in how we think about power, doesn't it?
A total paradigm shift.
It's no longer about controlling the territory a human lives on. It's about controlling the internal geography of the human mind and body.
And Huxley makes a highly pragmatic, almost clinical assessment of historical totalitarianism here. He looks at governments that rule by clubs, firing squads, artificial famine, mass imprisonment.
The classic dictator playbook.
Exactly. And he concludes that they are not merely cruel or inhumane. From a purely administrative standpoint, they are demonstrably inefficient.
Inefficient, wow.
Yeah, and in an era defined by advanced technology and scientific management, inefficiency is the ultimate cardinal sin.
I really want to pause on that word, inefficiency. If you're a dictator trying to run a country through brute force, you are essentially fighting a war of attrition against your own populace.
Right, it's exhausting.
Totally. You have to allocate massive resources to pay the secret police. You have to build and maintain vast networks of prisons. You constantly have to monitor for underground resistance movements, subversion, sabotage.
And every act of violence you commit just generates more resentment.
Right. Resentment breeds rebellion. It's this endless cycle of friction.
Mm.
And modern industrial society, above all else, absolutely despises friction.
Therefore, Huxley posits that a truly advanced, technologically capable society will just abandon the dictatorship of pain altogether.
Make it obsolete.
Exactly. Instead, they'll engineer a welfare tyranny.
Welfare tyranny. That's a chilling phrase.
It really is. This is a state where an all-powerful executive board of political bosses, supported by an army of specialized managers, controls a population of slaves who never have to be coerced.
Because they've been carefully curated to love their servitude.
Precisely. That is the true goal of the ultimate revolution, the total elimination of dissent through the total satisfaction of manufactured desires.
To make them genuinely love the cage. Not just tolerate it, not just fear the consequences of leaving it, but to look at the bars and feel a deep, comforting sense of gratitude.
Right. So Huxley lays out what he calls the problem of happiness.
Okay, that's that.
Well, he predicts that future governments won't be launching vast inquiries into how to build more destructive weapons because, weapons eventually destroy the workforce.
Which is inefficient.
Exactly. Rather, they'll launch vast government-sponsored inquiries into the psychology and biology of submission. Like, how do you make people actively desire their own subjugation?
That's horrifying.
To solve this problem of happiness, Huxley outlines 4 absolute requirements that a state must master.
Let's walk through those because they really form the literal blueprint of the world state in the novel.
Okay, so first, the state needs a greatly improved technique of suggestion. And this has to begin with rigorous infant conditioning and then be continually reinforced later in life by the use of drugs.
Catch them young, keep them medicated.
Right. Second, they require a fully developed science of human differences.
Meaning what exactly?
This involves assessing individuals and putting the right pegs in the right holes, ensuring that no one ever experiences the friction of being unsuited for their assigned role, because that prevents the development of what the state considers dangerous thoughts.
I get it. Because a round peg forced into a square hole is an uncomfortable peg. An uncomfortable peg gets frustrated. A frustrated peg starts questioning the design of the board, and a questioning peg is a threat to the entire system.
That's a perfect way to put it. Now, the third requirement is the invention of a foolproof substitute for alcohol and other traditional narcotics.
Something better than booze.
Right. Something that is profoundly pleasure-giving but entirely devoid of the harmful physical or social side effects that disrupt productivity.
No hangovers.
None. And fourth, and this is the most ambitious requirement, a long-term, comprehensive project of eugenics designed to fundamentally standardize the human product.
Standardize the human product.
Yeah.
It's wild. Like, if past dictatorships were like keeping a wolf on a tight, painful choke chain, constantly yanking it back every time it tried to run into the forest, this new model is entirely different. It's like embarking on a multi-generational breeding program to create a dog that doesn't even possess the physical musculature or the neurological instinct to want to leave the yard.
It literally couldn't leave if it tried.
Right. And then, just to be safe, you give that dog a heated bed, endless treats, and constant affection, so it never even looks at the fence. Why would it ever pull against a collar? It loves the yard.
Yeah.
It is biologically and psychologically inextricably bound to the yard.
And that's why the welfare in welfare tyranny is not an illusion. It is genuine, albeit in a deeply cynical, engineered way.
Yeah, it's real comfort.
The state is legitimately providing for the physical and base psychological needs of the population with perfect efficiency. Nobody is starving. Nobody is homeless. Nobody's living in a state of terror.
But the cost of that perfect provision, like the invisible price tag attached to that endless comfort, is the complete eradication of their humanity, their autonomy, their potential for growth.
Exactly.
But here is the logistical hurdle of creating a society that loves its chains to that absolute degree. You cannot simply take an adult human being with all their messy emotions, historical memories, and inherent drive for autonomy and convince them to accept this system.
No, it's too late by then.
Right, you can't even start when they are children, because by then, the chaotic variables of natural biology have already taken root. If you want absolute frictionless control, you have to start before the citizen is even born.
which pulls us directly out of the 1946 forward and plunges us into the horrifying, sterile reality of the novel's biological engineering.
Yeah, let's go into the central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre.
So we step immediately into this facility, and the very first thing the reader encounters is the motto of the world state emblazoned over the main entrance: community, identity, stability.
Community, identity, stability. Out of context, those sound like noble goals.
They do.
They sound like the core values of like a utopian neighborhood watch program. But when you look at how the world state actually manifests those words, the meaning becomes profoundly grotesque.
Very much so.
Community means the complete absorption of the individual into the collective mass. Identity means a rigid, inescapable caste designation determined before you draw your first breath. And stability means the absolute cessation of all human progress, conflict, or change.
And the reality of how they achieve this stability is entirely industrial. In this world, human reproduction has been completely severed from biology, intimacy, and the family unit.
It's just an assembly line.
Literally. They utilize a technique called Bokanovsky's process.
Bokanovskification. This is a terrifying triumph of their biological engineering. The director of the hatchery walks a group of new students through the facility, and he explains the process with this chilling, trembling enthusiasm.
He's so proud of it.
He really is. So they take a single human egg in a laboratory setting, but instead of letting it develop normally, they subject it to a series of violent shocks.
Yeah, they hit the egg with precise doses of X-rays, they plunge it into solutions of alcohol, they radically alter its environment.
And this trauma forces the egg to arrest its normal growth and begin to bud. It splits and splits again and splits again. From a single fertilized egg, instead of one unique human being, you can produce up to 96 identical twins.
The director explicitly states the goal here. He says, 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. They are producing standard men and women in uniform batches.
It's all about predictability.
Exactly. If the supreme goal of the state is absolute economic and social stability, then individuality is the ultimate enemy. Individuality means unpredictability.
Right, because if a factory is staffed by 96 completely unique individuals, they will have different energy levels, different grievances, different ambitions.
Different interpersonal conflicts. And that leads to strikes, to turnover, to inefficiency.
And we know how they feel about inefficiency.
Right. So by creating standardized batches of human clones, you eliminate the variable of human unpredictability from the workforce entirely.
The director boasts, "We decant our babies as socialized human beings." Decant. They aren't born. The word born is actually considered disgusting in this society. They are decanted, poured out of a bottle like a manufactured chemical solvent.
But Bokanovsky's process is only applied to the lower castes. The society is rigidly stratified into a hierarchy. You have alphas at the top, followed by betas, gammas, deltas, and finally the epsilons at the absolute bottom.
The heavy laborers.
Right. And to ensure this pyramid remains perfectly stable, they must assert total control over reproduction. They cannot allow accidental pregnancies to introduce unengineered humans into the system, so they deploy another biological intervention. They create free martins.
Free martins. So what exactly is that?
Well, the term free martin originally comes from agriculture. It refers to a sterile female calf born as a twin to a male. In the context of the world state, it is a deliberate, systematic process of forced sterilization before birth.
Wow.
Yeah. They expose the vast majority of female embryos to calculated doses of male sex hormones during their development in the artificial womb. This guarantees that they'll be born biologically sterile.
So they've engineered the capacity for unmanaged natural reproduction completely out of the human genome for the majority of the population.
Yes, but the sterilization is just the baseline. The most brutal, viscerally disturbing aspect of this biological caste system is how they handle the lower castes, specifically the deltas and epsilons.
These are the individuals destined to be the sewage workers, the elevator operators, the menial laborers who keep the physical infrastructure running.
Right. And the state doesn't just clone them. It intentionally sabotages their physical and mental development.
That part is just mind-blowing.
They practice a form of predestination through strict, calculated oxygen deprivation.
So as the embryos are moving along the conveyor belt in their artificial surrogate bottles, the technicians are carefully monitoring the oxygen flow.
And as one of the characters casually, almost cheerfully explains, the first biological system to be negatively affected by oxygen deprivation is the brain.
Followed by the skeletal structure.
Right. So the lower the caste you are destined for, the less oxygen you receive. At 70% of normal oxygen, you produce a human with significantly stunted intelligence and a dwarfed, physically inferior body.
I really want to emphasize the horror of this concept. They are intentionally, systematically inflicting brain damage on unborn children to ensure they fit a specific, predetermined economic quota.
Yes, they are manufacturing intellectual disability on an industrial scale.
And the economic rationale they provide for this atrocity is, well, within the closed loop of their own logic, completely unassailable.
Yeah, the technician explains that high human intelligence is simply not required for lower caste work. In fact, intelligence in a menial laborer is a massive liability.
Right. I mean, imagine if an epsilon was decanted with the high-functioning analytical intelligence of an alpha, but was biologically and socially trapped doing the mindless, repetitive work of a sewage technician for their entire life.
That person would go insane.
They would experience profound existential suffering, agonizing frustration, and eventually they would lash out at the system that trapped them. They'd become a source of social instability.
Exactly. So, within the twisted morality of the world state, stunting their brain development is framed not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of profound social mercy.
Social mercy. Wow.
They are engineering out the capacity to suffer. An epsilon's mind is biologically capped to mature at the level of a 10-year-old, while their physical body matures normally at 18.
This ensures they are physically capable of performing heavy manual labor, but biologically incapable of the higher-order abstract thought necessary to question their reality or, imagine a better life.
What's fascinating here is how Huxley synthesizes the industrial trends of his time. He saw mass production not just as a revolutionary method for manufacturing consumer goods, which, by the way, is why the society worships Henry Ford as their deity.
Right, replacing the Christian cross with the Model T, saying our Ford instead of our Lord.
Exactly. But Huxley saw the philosophy of mass production as a blueprint for manufacturing the human soul itself. The director of the Hatchery distills their entire philosophy into one sentence. He says, "The secret of happiness and virtue liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny."
Liking what you've got to do. That isn't just a motto, it is the fundamental operating system of the world state.
Truly.
But let's think about the practical limitations of that biological engineering for a second. You can stun a brain with oxygen deprivation, you can clone a worker 96 times, and you can create a workforce physically suited to menial labor. But biology is inherently messy.
Oh, definitely.
Even a stunted human brain still possesses rudimentary instincts. It still have chaotic base impulses. Like an epsilon might still wander off the job out of simple curiosity. A delta might still develop an inconvenient attachment to something outside of their economic function. Biological hardware limitations aren't quite enough to guarantee perfect frictionless obedience.
You're touching on the necessity of the next phase. If the biological engineering is the hardware, the world state still needs to write the software.
The psychological conditioning.
Right. The psychology of the individual must be conditioned just as rigorously and just as ruthlessly as their physical body. You have to program the mind to actively reject anything that doesn't serve the state.
Which moves us out of the hatchery and directly into the neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms. And I have to say, the scene that unfolds here is arguably one of the most viscerally disturbing in the entire text, because it involves the systematic torture of infants.
It's a very tough read.
It is.
Yeah.
We are shown a group of 8-month-old babies belonging to the Delta caste. They are placed on the floor of a large room. The nurses then bring out beautifully illustrated, brightly colored books and bowls of vibrant, fresh roses, and they place them on the floor in front of the infants.
Naturally, the babies respond with innate human curiosity and joy. They crawl toward the objects, babbling happily. They reach out their little hands to touch the soft petals of the roses and the smooth pages of the books.
It is a moment of pure, unconditioned human innocence.
And then the director, watching from above, gives a signal.
The nurses throw a switch. Instantly, the room is filled with terrifying, deafening noises, shrieking sirens, clanging alarm bells. And if that wasn't enough, the floor itself, which is wired, is electrified.
The babies are subjected to a series of mild but deeply painful electric shocks. Their bodies convulse. They are screaming, crying in absolute terror and agony.
They let this chaotic torture continue just long enough for the association to set in. Then the director waves his hand, the sirens stop, the electricity is cut off, and the room falls silent.
And then the nurses once again offer the babies the beautiful books and the fresh roses.
But this time, the reaction is entirely different. At the mere sight of a flower petal or printed page, the infants shrink away in absolute horror, howling in anticipated pain.
The director stands there, triumphant, and says to his students, "Observe, observe." He boasts that they have successfully linked the beautiful natural things of the world literature and nature with agonizing, unforgettable pain.
He even paraphrases the Bible, saying, "What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder." But, the question we have to ask is, why? What is the strategic benefit of electrocuting infants to make them terrified of a rose? It seems like pointless sadism.
Well, in the world state, nothing is pointless. And nothing is done purely for sadistic pleasure. Everything loops back to a rigid calculus of economics and consumption.
So what's the math here?
The director patiently unpacks the history of this specific conditioning for his students. He explains that roughly a century earlier, the state had actually experimented with conditioning the lower castes to like nature.
Right.
The economic theory at the time was that if the working class loved the countryside, they would be compelled to consume transport. They would buy train tickets, rent helicopters, and spend money moving out of the city on their days off.
I see the logic there, but there is a massive gaping hole in that specific business model.
Exactly. The director points out the fatal flaw. Primroses, landscapes, and fresh air have one grave, unforgivable defect in a capitalist utopia.
They're free.
They are completely gratuitous. As he puts it, a love of nature keeps no factories busy. If a Delta worker buys a train ticket, goes out to the country, and just sits in a meadow looking at the trees for 8 hours, they are not actively consuming anything other than that initial transport ticket.
They're not stimulating the manufacturing sector.
Exactly.
So the world state recognized the inefficiency and executed a massive societal pivot. They decided to rewrite the psychological software of the masses. They conditioned them to instinctively hate the country, to experience visceral terror at the sight of raw, uncommodified nature.
But they couldn't just have them sitting idle in the city either.
Right. So they simultaneously conditioned them to be obsessed with country sports. And they passed strict mandates ensuring that all legally recognized country sports require the use of highly elaborate, heavily manufactured apparatuses.
You can't just go to a park and kick a leather ball around. That doesn't generate enough capital. You have to play games like electromagnetic golf or centrifugal bumble puppy.
Centrifugal bumble puppy.
Yeah.
Just the name highlights the absurd, synthetic complexity of the equipment.
Yeah, so the state achieves a perfect, closed-loop economic perfection. The masses are still forced to consume transport to leave the city for these sports, but once they arrive, they are also forced to consume vast amounts of manufactured goods, keeping the factories perpetually busy.
It is the absolute total monetization of human behavior. They don't leave a single second of leisure time to chance. They engineer human desires strictly to fuel the economic engine.
And the psychological violence inflicted on those babies in the conditioning room isn't viewed by the state as cruel or abusive. It is considered a necessary, highly ethical public utility required to maintain the stability of the global markets.
And this psychological programming doesn't stop when the citizens are awake, does it?
Oh, no. The state recognizes that the subconscious mind is vulnerable, especially during sleep. So they deploy a technology called hypnopaedia, or sleep teaching.
Sleep teaching.
The director refers to it with absolute reverence as the greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time.
The mechanics of it are incredibly insidious. They place these small audio speakers under the pillows of the sleeping children in the dormitories. And throughout the night, while the child's conscious defenses are completely lowered, the speakers whisper specific, state-approved phrases.
Not facts, not education in the traditional sense, but moral judgments and class prejudices.
And they loop these whispers hundreds of thousands of times over the course of the child's development.
It operates entirely without reason or logic. The child isn't being taught to analyze a concept. They are being bombarded with suggestion. The text uses a very specific, deeply sticky metaphor to describe how this works. It says the words drop into the sleeping mind like drops of liquid sealing wax, drops that adhere, encrust, incorporate themselves with what they fall on, till finally the rock is all one scarlet blob.
I really want to unpack that sealing wax metaphor because it perfectly captures the violence of the process. Sealing wax isn't just paint. It goes on hot, it melts over the contours of whatever it touches, it fills in every crack, and then it hardens into an impenetrable shell, completely obscuring whatever was underneath.
Right.
It's like writing code for a computer, but instead of typing on a keyboard, they are dripping class consciousness, prejudices, and buying habits directly into a sleeping toddler's brain.
We hear an example of one of the audio loops designed for a beta child. The voice just whispers, I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta because I don't work so hard. And we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green and delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children.
No.
It just loops endlessly, cementing a deep, unshakable sense of caste superiority and segregation.
Think about the advertising jingles or corporate slogans you can recite from memory right now. Even though you never explicitly tried to learn them, they just seeped into your brain through repetition. Now imagine that level of cognitive infiltration happening while you sleep, completely bypassing your conscious consent. But instead of selling you a brand of cereal, it's selling you your entire worldview.
The narrator of the book states the terrifying result. Till at last the child's mind is these suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind.
It eradicates the very concept of an authentic internal life. By the time a citizen of the world state reaches adulthood, they do not possess original thoughts. They merely have a collection of state-recorded messages playing back in their heads, which they mistakenly identify as their own natural instincts.
And this is structurally vital for the state's survival, because if you don't possess a genuine internal life, you cannot experience internal conflict. And without internal conflict, you will never instigate external rebellion.
But let's look at the limits of even this perfect programming. Human beings are fundamentally biological creatures. Even if you stunt their brains, even if you electrocute them as infants, even if you drip sealing wax slogans into their sleeping minds for a decade, we still experience the friction of existence.
Biology is messy.
Right. We get physically tired, we experience stress, we feel the phantom aches of loneliness, the physical world rubs up against us and causes wear and tear. So how does the world state smooth over the inevitable cracks in the human psyche? Because if that friction builds up, the stability of the state is threatened.
The answer to that inevitable human friction is the implementation of infinite mandatory pleasure, which brings us to the final, most impenetrable layer of their prison.
The eradication of the family.
Yes, the systematic eradication of the family, the enforcement of sexual promiscuity, and the deployment of the ultimate drug, soma.
We have to start with the destruction of the family unit because the world state didn't just ban the concept of a traditional family, they made it neurologically repulsive to the citizens.
In this society, words like mother and father aren't just archaic terms, they are gross, unspeakable obscenities.
It's the equivalent of screaming a horrific slur in the middle of a crowded restaurant. If someone even implies the concept of viviparous reproduction, meaning a live biological birth, rather than decanting from a bottle, people literally blush, gasp, and cover their ears in genuine distress.
To understand why the state had to destroy the family, we have to look at the philosophy of Mustapha Mond.
The resident world controller for Western Europe.
Right. He is one of the 10 men who rule the globe. When Mond speaks to a group of students, he describes what the concept of home used to be in the pre-modern era. And the way he frames it is incredibly persuasive if you are looking at human history entirely through the lens of maximizing stability.
He describes the historical home as an under-sterilized prison.
Yeah, he paints a horrific claustrophobic picture. Darkness, disease, bad smells. A man, a periodically teeming, exhausted woman, a chaotic rabble of boys and girls of all ages fighting for resources.
He focuses entirely on the suffocating proximity and the intense, volatile, emotional dynamics of family life. He calls it a perversion, a breeding ground for madness, suicide, and what he astutely terms isolating pain.
That phrase, isolating pain, is the key to understanding the world state's fear of the family.
How so?
Well, if you deeply love your mother and your mother falls ill and dies, you experience a level of grief that isolates you from the broader community. You withdraw. Your productivity plummets. Your focus shifts from serving society to mourning your individual loss.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, if you are deeply, exclusively in love with your spouse, your children, your primary loyalty is to them, not to the state.
Right. Exclusive love is a direct rival to state loyalty. The state demands a monopoly on the individual's devotion. If a man will die to protect his family, he is a dangerous, unpredictable variable. If he has no family, his only anchor is the state.
Mond distills this into a rigid mathematical formula. No civilization without social stability. No social stability without individual stability.
Strong emotional feelings, whether they be passionate love or profound grief, create instability.
Passion creates what he calls neurasthenia, a nervous exhaustion. Therefore, All deep emotional attachments, all forms of exclusivity must be eradicated by replacing them with instant, meaningless gratification.
Which perfectly explains the hypnopaedic proverb they're all taught from childhood. Everyone belongs to everyone else.
In the world state, sexual promiscuity isn't just permitted, it is a rigid, enforceable social mandate.
We see this play out in a deeply unsettling conversation between a character named Lenina and her friend Fanny. Lenina casually mentions that she has been exclusively dating one man, Henry Foster, for about 4 months. And Fanny isn't just surprised, she is genuinely appalled and frightened for her friend.
She aggressively scolds Lenina, warning her that exclusivity is highly dangerous and that the director will be furious if he finds out she isn't behaving more promiscuously.
It's wild.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Huxley makes an incredibly prescient, eerie prediction in his 1946 foreword regarding this exact dynamic. He notes that as political and economic freedom diminishes in totalitarian society, sexual freedom tends to increase as a sort of psychological compensation.
The smart dictator, Huxley argues, will actively encourage that specific type of freedom because it provides an exhaust valve for human energy. It helps reconcile the subjects to the absolute servitude, which is their unchangeable fate.
It's the ultimate weaponized distraction.
If your base biological appetites are instantly satisfied the moment they arise, you never build up the psychic energy or the deep-seated frustration required to rebel. You never sit alone in your room feeling unfulfilled or questioning your purpose because society forcefully demands that you distract yourself immediately with another person.
But of course, even endless promiscuity and endless consumerism aren't quite enough to completely numb the creeping existential dread of human consciousness. The state needs a failsafe, a chemical guarantee.
And that chemical guarantee is soma.
Soma. The state-mandated narcotic.
The text describes it as having all the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects.
I want to pause on that because calling it a substitute feels like an understatement. If you look at how it functions in the society, it's not just a replacement for alcohol. It's an entirely new mechanism for state control.
It is euphorically pleasant, slightly hallucinant, and completely narcotic.
But its defining feature, the reason the state distributes it alongside their paychecks, is that it has absolutely no hangover. It does not damage the liver, it does not cause violent outbursts, and it does not disrupt the worker's ability to return to the assembly line at full capacity the next morning.
The citizens treat it like breath mints. The moment anyone feels a slight twinge of melancholy or experiences a moment of awkward silence in a conversation, someone else instantly pulls out a bottle and says, "What you need is a gram of soma."
They use it to systematically erase any negative emotion.
The text says they take half a gram for a half holiday, a gram for a weekend, and 3 grams for a dark eternity on the moon. They literally drug themselves into comatose states for days at a time to take chemical holidays from reality whenever the mildest friction occurs.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a profound paradigm shift in how authority operates. Historically, totalitarian states weaponized pain. They used torture, imprisonment, and public execution to enforce compliance.
But pain has a fatal flaw.
Yeah.
It causes resentment, and it creates martyrs.
Comfort, on the other hand, creates profound dependency. By eliminating all prohibitions and aggressively supplying pleasure, the world state has weaponized comfort. They have eliminated the very friction that causes human beings to grow, to reflect, and to mature.
Soma feels like the ultimate chemical version of modern doom scrolling. Think about how an algorithm works today. It is designed to give you exactly what you want, a constant drip of novelty and micro-entertainment the exact second you feel a twinge of boredom or anxiety.
It prevents you from ever having to sit quietly in a room with your own thoughts.
Soma is that algorithm in pill form. It builds a chemical wall between the human mind and reality. And it makes me want to challenge the very premise of their utopia. Is it actually possible to have too much comfort? If you never feel pain, if you never feel the dull ache of waiting, the sting of a minor heartbreak, or the frustration of failure, do you ever actually feel alive?
Well, the architects of the world state would answer that question by arguing that feeling alive in the passionate, turbulent way you describe is a romantic, deeply outdated concept that leads directly to war, poverty, and mass misery.
They believe they have made a noble trade.
They have traded the extreme peaks and the devastating valleys of the human experience for a flat, perfectly paved, endlessly continuous highway of perpetual mild amusement.
But maintaining that perfectly paved highway requires a monumental sacrifice. You can't just mandate pleasure. You have to actively destroy anything that might compete with it for the human soul.
To keep the wheels of the economy turning and the citizens perfectly numb, the world state had to banish everything that historically gave human life deep meaning.
And this brings us to the intellectual climax of the sources we are analyzing today, the grand philosophical showdown.
Yes, the confrontation between the savage, a young man named John who was born naturally and raised outside the world state on a savage reservation, whose entire moral framework is built on reading a salvaged copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare and Mustapha Mond, the resident world controller.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and where the moral absolute of the story gets incredibly murky. Mustapha Mond is not a cartoon villain.
Not at all.
He isn't a mindless bureaucrat blindly following orders. He is a deeply educated, brilliant, highly self-aware man who understands exactly what the state has destroyed and exactly why it had to be destroyed. When the savage starts passionately quoting Shakespeare in Mond's office, Mond doesn't look confused. He recognizes the quotes immediately.
He actually keeps old banned books locked in a safe right behind his desk.
That detail is crucial. The man tasked with censoring the world's literature has the forbidden texts locked in his own office. It shows that the censorship is not born of ignorance. It is a calculated strategic suppression. The savage asks Mond the obvious question. If you know these books are beautiful, if you understand the power of Shakespeare, why don't you let the people read them? Why keep them locked away?
And Mond answers by explaining the terrifying historical turning point that birthed the world state. He talks about the 9 Years' War.
Right.
He describes a period of global conflict characterized by massive economic collapse and the use of anthrax bombs. Biological warfare popping all around the globe, wiping out entire populations. The world was standing on the absolute brink of total, irreversible annihilation.
Mond explains the psychology of a traumatized globe. He says that after the 9 Years' War, humanity was finally ready to submit. They were so exhausted by the bloodshed, the chaos, and the terror that they actively chose to have their appetites controlled.
They willingly traded their freedom, their art, and their autonomy for a quiet life. They wanted safety more than they wanted truth or beauty. Anything for a quiet life.
So happiness and base comfort officially replaced truth and beauty as the supreme, unassailable values of human society. Mond explicitly lays out why high art had to be sacrificed. He states that true art requires instability.
You cannot write a great sweeping tragedy about human suffering if nobody in your society is ever unhappy.
As Mond pragmatically puts it, you can't make flivvers without steel, and you can't make tragedies without social instability. Because the world state has used science to eliminate disease, old age, and unrequited love, there is simply no raw material left for art.
Instead, they provide the masses with feelies, superficial, tactile movies, and synthetically generated music. It stimulates the senses perfectly, but it carries absolutely no emotional or intellectual weight.
And the sacrifice doesn't end with art. Mond reveals that they had to sacrifice pure science as well. This is deeply ironic for a society founded on scientific management. But Mond explains that uncontrolled theoretical knowledge is a profound menace.
Every new scientific discovery about the fundamental nature of reality is a potential threat to the established stability. Truth's a menace. Science is a public danger, he says. The state only permits applied science research that makes life more comfortable, extends the manufacturing process, or synthesizes new food.
They strictly prohibit any scientific inquiry that asks fundamental, destabilizing questions about the universe. And inevitably, as they strip away art and science, the conversation turns to the ultimate forbidden topic, God and religion.
Mond opens his safe, pulls out old crumbling texts by Cardinal Newman and Maine de Biran, and reads them to the savage. He fully acknowledges the historical argument for religion, that people historically turned to God out of a sense of isolation, the fear of aging, and a desperate need for consolation as their bodies broke down and the world proved cruel.
But Mond points out the terrifying, sterile triumph of the world state. They have technologically obsoleted God.
Yeah, they have preserved youth artificially. Citizens never physically age past the appearance of a vibrant 30-year-old before they simply drop dead instantly at age 60. They have eradicated disease, and through their conditioning, they have completely eradicated solitude. People are never alone.
Therefore, the psychological vulnerabilities that historically drove humanity to seek divine consolation no longer exist. Mond essentially looks at the savage and says, we don't need God anymore because we have successfully synthesized everything God used to provide. You want consolation for your suffering. We have soma. You want a sense of providence and order. We have the hatchery and the conditioning centers.
And Mond defines their modern, cynical view of philosophy with a truly brutal quote. He says, "You remind me of another of those old fellows called Bradley. He defined philosophy as the finding of bad reasons for what one believes by instinct. As if one believed anything by instinct. One believes things because one has been conditioned to believe them. Finding bad reasons for what one believes for other bad reasons, that's philosophy."
Mond is systematically deconstructing the entire foundational architecture of human thought. He is telling the savage that the desire for independence and deep understanding is actually an unnatural, painful state for a human being. People don't genuinely want freedom.
Freedom is a heavy, terrifying burden that requires making choices and suffering consequences. They want safety. They want to be told exactly what to do, what to buy, and who to sleep with, so long as the instructions are accompanied by a chemical guarantee that it will feel good.
The world controllers are not ignorant. They have actively, consciously chosen to lock away Shakespeare, to lock away pure science, and to lock away God, all to protect the fragile masses from the immense danger of deep emotion.
And this reveals the paradox of Mustapha Mond. He reveals to the savage that in his youth he was a pure scientist. He was a brilliant, inquisitive mind doing illicit, unauthorized research into the true nature of reality.
But his research was discovered by the authorities, and he was given a choice. He could be exiled to an island with all the other nonconformists and individualists to pursue truth in isolation, or he could give up pure science, surrender his pursuit of truth, and join the World Controllers Council to manage the happiness of others.
He chose to stay. He chose to give up truth to serve the manufactured happiness of the masses. He willingly sacrificed his own soul, his own intellectual freedom, to keep the rest of humanity safe, stable, and comfortably numb.
It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Is Mustapha Mond actually a villain? Or is he the ultimate tragic pragmatist? Think about his perspective. He looked at a world that was literally blowing itself to radioactive smithereens with anthrax bombs, a world drowning in blood and ideological warfare, and he made a calculated decision that a lobotomized artificial peace was fundamentally better than the total extinction of the human race.
That is the enduring genius of Huxley's writing. He doesn't give you an easy out. Mond's arguments are dangerously, compellingly coherent. When you contrast the sterile, happy, painless perfection of the world state against the bloody, disease-ridden, war-torn, chaotic reality of actual human history, Mond's position seems almost heroic. He is bearing the heavy burden of truth and history so that the masses don't have to suffer under its weight.
I see the logic, but the savage absolutely refuses to accept it. He rejects Mond's cold pragmatism entirely. He doesn't buy the premise that a painless life is a life worth living. And this ideological collision leads us to the final, desperate demand of the novel, the absolute right to suffer.
The savage looks at all of this perfectly engineered comfort, this padded, temperature-controlled cell of a society, and he tries to make an argument for the messy reality of humanity. He brings up concepts that the world state finds absurd: chastity, danger, self-denial. He argues that the struggle to overcome temptation, the endurance of pain, and the commitment to something higher than base pleasure give human beings a reason for nobility and heroism.
And Mond just brushes the argument aside like it's a child's complaint. He tells the savage that civilization has absolutely no structural need for nobility or heroism. In fact, Mond argues that heroism is just a symptom of profound political inefficiency.
If a society is organized properly, if the supply chains are secure and the conditioning is flawless, nobody ever has to be a hero. You only need heroes when the system fails, when things go terribly wrong. In the world state, nobody is ever tempted to do the wrong thing because there are no prohibitions. If you are perfectly conditioned to only want what you can easily have, there is no temptation to resist, and therefore, no virtue in resisting it.
But the savage pushes further. He asks about the basic physiological need for excitement. Even if society is perfectly safe, isn't there something fundamentally human about the adrenaline of living dangerously? And it's here that Mond reveals the final, deeply cynical, synthetic mechanism of the world state. The VPS.
The violent passion surrogate.
Exactly. The state recognizes that the human endocrine system occasionally requires a jolt. So once a month, every single citizen is required to go to a clinic. They're hooked up to machines, and their entire biological system is flooded with a precise dose of adrenaline. It provides them with the complete, overwhelming physiological equivalent of terror and rage.
Mond describes it with chilling precision. He says it provides all the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello, but without any of the messy actual inconveniences of real violence or real tragedy.
That is such a twisted dystopian concept. They chemically simulate the visceral feeling of fighting for your life, of experiencing profound, passionate rage, just to clear out the biological plumbing. It's a synthetic purge.
Yeah.
And when the savage hears this, he finally understands the totality of his defeat. He realizes there is absolutely no arguing with the airtight circular logic of the world state.
It has an answer for everything. It has synthesized every single profound human experience, love, fear, religion, art, into a harmless, sterile, government-issued pill or process.
So he abandons logic and makes his final emotional stand. He declares, "But I don't want comfort. I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin."
And Mustapha Mond, with the absolute, unshakable calm of a man who has won the argument centuries ago, replies, "In fact, you're claiming the right to be unhappy."
"I'm claiming the right to be unhappy," the savage says. And Mond just shrugs, indifferent to the dramatic weight of the moment, and casually lists the true cost of that demand. He says, "Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind." And the savage, standing in the face of all that inevitable human misery, is silent for a long time. Finally, he says, "I claim them all." This raises an important question, perhaps the most important question we can ask about the nature of our own existence. The savage is arguing that the full, authentic spectrum of the human experience must inevitably include suffering, fear, disease, and the agonizing struggle against our own base impulses. If you artificially strip away the darkness, the light loses all contrast and all meaning.
Think about the implications of the violent passion surrogate. If you can chemically simulate the profound feeling of overcoming a massive life-threatening challenge without actually doing anything, does achievement mean anything anymore?
Let's take that a step further and ground it in a modern context. Imagine playing a highly immersive video game. But this game is rigged so that you literally cannot lose. The game essentially plays itself. It perfectly anticipates your moves, hands you the championship trophy, and simultaneously chemically injects a massive dose of dopamine directly into your brain so you feel the exact neurological rush of having just won the World Cup.
You didn't train, you didn't struggle, you didn't even really press the buttons, but you feel the euphoria of victory.
After the first day, it might feel incredible. After a week, you wouldn't feel happy. You would feel a deep, sickening emptiness. You'd feel like a hostage to the simulation. You would find yourself desperately begging for the chance to fail, for the chance to lose, just to know that your actions had actual, tangible consequences in reality. The savage realizes that a world entirely devoid of consequence is a world entirely devoid of humanity.
Huxley is showing us that for a totalitarian regime to be absolute, it doesn't need to be actively cruel. By systematically eliminating pain, the world state has systematically eliminated the human soul. The right to be unhappy is fundamentally the right to be human. It is the right to make terrible mistakes, to feel the crushing weight of the consequences of those mistakes, and to forge your own character through the arduous process of growing from them.
So let's synthesize the massive journey we've been on today. We started by walking through the cold, tiled, sterile rooms of the central London hatchery, watching human beings get mass-produced on a biological assembly line, their brains intentionally, systematically starved of oxygen just to fit them into a neat, frictionless little economic box.
We moved into the psychological programming of the sleep-teaching dormitories, where children's minds are entirely overwritten with state-sponsored slogans and consumerist prejudices before they can even speak their first word.
We waded through the drug-induced, consequence-free, euphoric haze of soma and the mandated, meaningless distraction of forced promiscuity. And finally, we sat across from the sterile desk of Mustapha Mond, the world controller, who looked us in the eye and explained exactly logically why all of this horror was necessary to save us from ourselves.
We have seen in terrifying detail how Huxley envisioned a world where humanity isn't crushed beneath the heel of a military boot, but rather suffocated by a pillow of mandatory, inescapable pleasure.
Suffocated by a pillow of pleasure that captures the exact nature of the threat. And for you, the listener, the reason this deep dive matters right now, the reason this isn't just a recap of an old theoretical English class assignment, is because we are currently living in an age of unprecedented, endless digital distraction.
Yeah.
We carry incredibly powerful algorithms in our pockets, systems designed by some of the smartest engineers on the planet whose sole optimized purpose is to figure out exactly what will keep us comfortable, amused, distracted, and scrolling.
We are constantly, aggressively offered convenient comforts that promise to smooth out the difficult, messy friction of our daily lives.
And we have to ask ourselves as we engage with these systems, how much of our own autonomy, how much of our own beautiful, frustrating, deeply human friction are we voluntarily trading away in exchange for a quiet, easy, frictionless life?
And that leads directly to a final, lingering thought we want to leave you with, looping back one last time to Huxley's 1946 foreword. Huxley deeply believed that humanity would eventually face a stark, unavoidable choice between two extreme destinies. On one hand, we face the terror of atomic destruction, a society that ultimately destroys itself because it utterly refuses to control its rapidly advancing technologies and its violent, chaotic passions. On the other hand, we face the welfare tyranny of the world state's utopia.
He wrote, with grim pragmatism, you pays your money and you takes your choice.
So consider this deeply unsettling scenario. If the only alternative to the world state is a society that literally blows itself to radioactive smithereens in a chaotic, uncontrollable global war, at what point does Mustapha Mond's terrifying, sterile, engineered utopia actually become the most ethical, necessary choice for the sheer biological survival of the human race? Are we truly brave enough to demand our freedom if that freedom means choosing our own absolute destruction?
It brings us right back to the beginning. We thought the diagnosis of a totalitarian society would be obvious, a clear, violent villain we could easily identify and fight. Instead, we are looking into the murky waters of our own deepest desires for comfort and safety. We're looking at a disease that feels exactly like a cure. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the comfort,